Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Robinson Run. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. On this part of the series, episode 18, we are continuing our discussion of the Whiskey Rebellion, an event that was the second largest domestic rebellion in American history, of course only behind the American Civil War, and an event that was a real turning point in American history. It was the greatest crisis of George Washington's presidency. What's pretty amazing for us was that this event not only changed the fortunes of early America, our early republic as it were, during the presidency of George Washington, but it was a critical event in the history of Robinson Run. It's an amazing thing when we began this project that we just chose really four families at random: the Walkers, the Ewings, the Scotts. I guess there's two Walkers there, so we can throw them in there as well. And they find themselves in the middle of this really amazing event that in a lot of ways has been building for now decades. If you'll remember, in the 1780s, during the American Revolution, the citizens, the inhabitants of Robinson Run were loyal patriots, fierce patriots in fact, but they were undersupplied and they were undermanned and they were badly vulnerable to attacks from British allied native peoples. And they begged for support. They told the Continental Congress that if help didn't come, something terrible would happen to them. And of course, they were right. We saw in previous episodes that British allied native warriors attacked and destroyed Robinson Run in September of 1782. Well, there was a real sense amongst really all the Scots-Irish settlers, especially on the frontier, that the federal government couldn't do anything for them, or wouldn't, even worse, do anything for them. And in 1791, when Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton and President George Washington put a tax on whiskey, that was, the primary economic driver of the American West, they took it as a personal affront to their values. Now, in the previous episode, and I encourage you to watch it, we saw how resistance formed, I think, really quickly, metastasized here on the frontier. But not everyone was a violent rebel insurrectionist. We saw that in Pittsburgh's West End, the Old Stone Tavern was really a central focus point of Western life. Men like Joseph Scott and Gabriel Walker and Isaac Walker, who we've been following now for the better part of 20 years, met there to express their displeasure and their dislike of this new law. And that's where we're going to pick up here in 1791, September. Because in September of 1791, almost 9 years to the day that Robinson Run is destroyed, we see two very different forms of resistance emerge. One is legal and I think appropriate, and the other will, as we'll see, be quite violent. In September of 1791, community leaders from what is really the heart of Western Pennsylvania got together to express their problems and grievances with this new Whiskey Act. And they met, as you can see on the screen here, in the capitals of the four counties on the screen. And these were prominent people from all over, but those capitals included Brownsville in Fayette County, Greensburg in Westmoreland County, Washington, of course, the county seat of Washington County, Pennsylvania, and they met in Pittsburgh in Allegheny County. And what they did was make a list of grievances, a list of very clearly defined reasons why they believe this law, in fact, hurt them. They collectively got together after these resolves were done in what is today downtown Pittsburgh at a place called, and it's a name you'll know, the Sign of the Green Tree Tavern. So if you're familiar with Green Tree, Pennsylvania, that's a direct correlation to that place. But this wasn't in modern Green Tree, Pennsylvania. This happened in downtown Pittsburgh, along what is today the Boulevard of the Allies. And at the Green Tree Tavern, they made a extensive, clearly defined, peaceful list of resolutions as to why this law should be removed. Now, this was not a radical assembly. That's important. There were very legitimate people at the sign of the Green Tree Tavern in September of 1791, including William Findley, who was the congressman at large for the region, a man named Albert Gallatin, who was a Pennsylvania assemblyman and one day a U.S. senator, and in the future, he would be the longest serving Treasury Secretary in American history. And they, again, made a gentleman's document as to why this law is very harmful to them and needed to be removed. One of the people in attendance at that meeting, and I think this is really important, was James Ewing. Now, why does that matter to us? Well, remember when we visited the Old Stone Tavern in the last episode, we saw a tavern ledger, this amazing document that survived into the year 2025. And in that document, it listed all the major people in and around the Pittsburgh area that visited that tavern. And as I've mentioned previously, it was one of the real focal points of kind of resistance of the tax. And we saw Isaac Walker's name in it. We saw Gabriel Walker's name in it. And we saw Joseph Scott's name in it. That's all in the previous episode, 17. But one name we didn't see was James Ewing, Squire James Ewing. Recall the biggest landowner, or one of the biggest landowners in this region, certainly the largest and wealthiest in Robinson Run. Squire James Ewing was sort of a baron of land here, if you would. James Ewing wasn't at that radical assembly, but he was at the moderate assembly, the peaceful resolutions here at the sign of the Green Tree Tavern. He was in attendance. So right there, that's going to set for us a very clear idea that even in Robinson Run, just like today in America, politically, these people were divided. The Walkers, the Scotts tended to be more anti-Constitution, anti-federal government. And I don't mean they were against the Constitution totally, but I don't think they had their faith in it, because clearly it wasn't, in their opinion, protecting their rights. But Squire James Ewing, the wealthiest man in Robinson Run, one of the wealthier men in Pittsburgh, clearly seemed to believe that there was a place for him and peaceful resolution, as it were, in the West as well. So that's one of the great reasons we are studying this, and what we find is that they're not all the same. They're not all angry, snarling rebels against the American Republic, but there are people that want to find a way forward. Part of the reason we think James Ewing, and by we, I guess I mean just you and I, because really there's not too many people studying this, gravitated toward the federal government side, is because, and again, I'll put the map up for this. If you look at his property lines, he shares borders and boundaries with wealthy, powerful, federally appointed officers. One of them we'll meet here shortly, named John Neville. Just like America today, people are divided politically. That was certainly the case here in Robinson Run. But what we can tell already, and we'll see this as a strand throughout the show, James Ewing always seems to be on the federal government side, while most of the Robinson Run community is on the other side, very anti-government. What's at the core of this? Well, it goes back to the very beginning. You'll recall that men like Gabriel Walker, Isaac Walker, and Joseph Scott, just the three names we picked at random from this community, but I think it's turned out to be really productive. They were from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a Scots-Irish community. James Ewing, remember, was from Cecil County, Maryland. I don't know if that makes a big difference, but Maryland was much wealthier than Pennsylvania. Maryland was on the Chesapeake Bay. The richest people in America lived in the Chesapeake Bay area. So perhaps James Ewing tends to be more conservative politically in terms of who he aligns himself with, maybe aligning himself more with wealthy and powerful people. But what we do know is by 1791, a peaceful resolution is sought by some Westerners. Important for us, James Ewing is amongst them. Alexander Hamilton and Congress, as allies in Congress, will receive this petition from the Green Tree Tavern in 1791. And again, he knows exactly what's in the law as Treasury Secretary. He basically wrote it. And he knows that it could be viewed as harmful to Westerners. Westerners would say he's doing that on purpose to kind of put them in their place, to make them accept federal authority. Hamilton would say, no, that's not why I'm doing it. It's not personal. He would say, I'm just trying to, one, collect revenue taxes from these people, and two, I'm trying to foster national unity. Who's right and who's wrong? That's all a matter, of course, of politics. But Hamilton, for what it's worth, does order the tax lowered with the production of this document really pleading the federal government to reconsider. But here's the problem. He has it lowered by just 1 cent. 1 cent. I mean, literally the lowest possible amount he could lower it. And when we think about the exorbitant penalties associated with the tax and the real damage it would do to the small farmer in the West, in their opinion, Western farmers, frontiersmen, people like the Walkers and the Scots here in Western Pennsylvania view this as an insult. And that's when we start to see violence emerge. Almost immediately after the reduction of that tax, we start to see tax collectors in Western Pennsylvania assaulted, bodily assaulted. The very first person is a man named Robert Johnson. He's a Westerner too, but he works for the Treasury Department. And at a place called Pigeon Creek, today Monongahela, Pennsylvania, in Washington County, he'll be attacked, pulled from his horse, stripped naked, whipped, tarred, and feathered. No feathering, let me correct that, just burning hot tar on his body. And it's a really violent assault. For folks in Allegheny County, Robert Johnson was local. How local was he? Well, he lived in what is today Bridgeville. So he knew these people, and he probably knew the community members at Robinson Run. The Western frontier seems like a big place, but it was really a small place when you talk about the people that lived there. They were all cousins and in-laws. They were all related to each other in some way. So in a lot of ways, the Whiskey Rebellion is a very personal affair. Other tax collectors and government officials will be attacked at that same time. And as early as 1792, Alexander Hamilton begins offering or proposing to President Washington that perhaps the federal government needs to send troops to this area to suppress these people, to put them in their place. Washington and his Attorney General Edmund Randolph say, no, we're not going to do that. But early on, of course, Hamilton seems to be pushing for that very extreme action. Now, where is the locus of power for this radical movement? Because the moderates tried a peaceful resolution, men like James Ewing, and it didn't work. It got a 1 cent reduction. Well, for us, the real heart of this rebel movement is going to be right near where that tax collector Robert Johnson was attacked, today Monongahela, Pennsylvania, in and around a place called the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church. Now, the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church is going to become the place where all of the Westerners meet and discuss how to best resist this action. But it'll turn into something much greater. They'll begin organizing into militia units. Interestingly enough, we did a whole episode on the Washington County Militia because Robinson Run and Allegheny County were part of the Washington County range at that time. Allegheny County will be carved out a little later. We start to see men falling back into their old revolutionary units with their old revolutionary commanders. That's one of the really challenging things about the Whiskey Rebellion is that in the 1780s, these men are fighting for the creation of America. They are ardent patriots. And then just 10 years later, they begin to fight against that same country in the Whiskey Rebellion. We love our history black and white. We do. History's not black and white, though. It's very gray, murky. And as historians, we have to dive into that murky spot where most people aren't comfortable because that's where the real work is. So let's go ahead and jump to Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church. We're going to be there in a second. I'm going to show you around. But I want to say something really quickly about it. I'm going to introduce you to the major leaders of the Whiskey Rebellion movement. We do not have any evidence on paper that Gabriel Walker or Isaac Walker or Joseph Scott, and certainly not James Ewing, were ever at Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church. That is to say, not that they weren't there, but we don't have it on paper. But the problem is, and the issue is, the Walkers and the Scotts, and probably even James Ewing, who skews to the other side, more in favor of the federal government, they knew all these people. I would find it very difficult to believe that one of them was not at the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church, because that's where all the moving and shaking of this whole story is going to happen. So hang on 1 second. We're going to leave the office. We're going to jump down to Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church outside of Monongahela, Pennsylvania, and we're going to do a quick tour of that ground. See you there. We are in the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church Cemetery, just outside of Monongahela, Pennsylvania. And if you want to study the Whiskey Rebellion, if you want to get to know some of these whiskey rebels, this is the place where you're going to find them. We are in Washington County, Pennsylvania, and during the Whiskey Rebellion, this location was the site where the whiskey rebels would meet. They'd have their courts, they'd have their decisions, they'd decide where they would attack, who they would single out as people treacherous to the cause of the Whiskey Rebellion. And again, you're going to notice in this cemetery a lot of flags. And these flags are here because most of the men who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion were Revolutionary War veterans. They were members of the Washington County Militia, and they fiercely defended their homes. They were Scots-Irish Presbyterians during the Revolution from Native American attacks. And in a lot of ways, because this was the center of the Whiskey Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebels were sort of a reunion of the Washington County Militia from the American Revolution. You know, we don't want to simplify it too much, but when you look at some of the prominent Revolutionary War veterans here in this cemetery, you'll see men like John and Daniel Hamilton, as well as John Holcroft, and the person we're going to meet next, James McFarland. And you'll notice they are not only Revolutionary War heroes, as denoted by their flags on their graves, but very prominent whiskey rebels. So there's a very fine line between hero and villain in this story. And I think that's something we want to key in on. So we're coming up here on the grave of James McFarland. James McFarland was very much the hero of this region in the Revolution. He was sort of the quiet man. He didn't say much early on in the rebellion, and he didn't engage in a lot of the really sort of tumultuous activities, but when the time came, here's his grave, he did show up to fight, and he lost his life. So here we have James McFarland's grave, marked as number 4. Here lies the body of Captain James McFarland. He departed this life on July 17, 1794 at 43. He served through the war with undaunted courage in defense of American independence against the lawless and despotic encroachments of Great Britain. He fell by the hands of an unprincipled villain in support of what he supposed to be the rights of his country, much lamented by numerous and respectable circle of acquaintances. And of course, they're talking about when he was killed at Bower Hill, the major battle of the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. So he has a hero's burial for sure. But again, he complicates things because just 10 years after the Revolution, he was fighting to dismantle that country that he fought to form. Here we have David Hamilton, notable member, of this early insurrection, prominent member here at the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church. So if you want to meet the major figures of the Whiskey Rebellion, this is the place to come. But understand it's a complicated legacy. We celebrate these men for being members of the patriot cause in the American Revolution. The flag stands proudly in the middle of the cemetery. But they also fought against the Republic, ultimately fighting in a secessionist movement just 10 years after the American Revolution ended. So again, the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church. If we look across the street, you're going to see a statue of a minister carved out of the stump of a tree. That was the original meeting place of the congregation when it was here in the 1780s and 1790s. They met under an enormous tree, an oak tree, I believe, and that tree has since fallen and collapsed into disrepair, as all living things do.
But they've carved that tree into a memorial. Again, this is the modern meeting house here. That's what they carved into a memorial at the time. So if you want to see the 1790s, you're going to see it here. You're going to see a lot of names you'll recognize over and over again. Names like Hamilton, names like Scott, names like McFarland. These are Scots-Irish names, and that's no surprise here. Here we have the graves of two of those important figures, John Hamilton and James Hamilton, again adorned with Revolutionary War flags, you can see. So there's a lot to see here. We can't do that all today. It's rainy, it's nasty. But it's one of the great places you want to find. We have somebody down here, right? We're doing a little sightseeing here, a little starstruck, right? Meeting celebrities. We have someone down here, and of course, he's the big one. General John Hamilton. General John Hamilton, if there was someone who was the face of the Whiskey Rebellion, the leader of the Whiskey Rebellion, it was John Hamilton. John Hamilton was not only a high-ranking law enforcement official here in Washington County, but he was the head of the state militia in the region. He was appointed by the governor himself. And that's a real problem when that same person is also leading the rebellion that he would be forced to, right, put down if necessary. So these are the kind of things you see here. But John Hamilton, we definitely want to make a chance to have a chance to see him.
Now that we've met the rebel side here in the West, let's take a look at the federal side. George Washington by 1792 and 93 was really starting to realize that the western frontier, Robinson Run amongst many communities, was spinning out of control. And he did predict this may happen. I want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of my book, The Whiskey Rebellion, A Distilled History of an American Crisis. For what it's worth, named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 10 books to read for the year 2023. And number one on Amazon for several weeks when it came out in 2023. I'm very proud of it. Of course, it was in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal too, and changed my life. Just throwing that out there, of course. But this will explain that book this story in much more detail. You can buy it on Amazon or anywhere books are sold. If they still have bookstores when you're watching this, of course, you can buy it there. But George Washington needed a person in the West he could count on. Someone that was loyal to the federal government, someone that he knew personally, and someone who is, steadfastly attached to the Constitution. And the man that he decides to put in charge to name what we call Inspector of Revenue for the 4th District of Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, is a name you're all going to know, but you may not know the person. General John Neville. So who is John Neville? John Neville was one of the richest men, not just in Western Pennsylvania, but in the entire Western frontier. John Neville was a Revolutionary War hero. He was a Virginian. He fought in the French and Indian War. He fought in Lord Dunmore's War of 1774, this action by the colony of Virginia against the Shawnees. He fought there. Neville had really amazing service. He fought with George Washington in New Jersey. He wintered with President Washington at Valley Forge. General John Neville was taken captive in Charleston, South Carolina in 1780. He was a man who risked it all for his country. And Westerners, Pittsburghers, and frontier farmers loved him for it. So John Neville will be in charge of collecting revenue. He is intimately involved in the lives of all of the people we've talked about in this show. I'll throw up the land map here in a second for you to look at. John Neville's property bordered James Ewing's property. These are two of the most prominent businessmen in Western Pennsylvania and in the whole frontier, and especially along the Chartiers Creek. They were two powerhouses. So it's no wonder James Ewing sided with the Federals while his neighbors, the Walkers and the Scots, sided with the rebels. Politics are funny that way. At any rate, General John Neville is given the job of being the chief tax collector in this region. President Washington hopes that no one will attack him because they know that people like him, they respect him, they admire him. John Neville has this enormous plantation, which we'll see in a second, in what is today Scott Township, just about 3 miles away from Robinson Run. It's called Bower Hill, and it's a sprawling thousands of acres estate. And he's got enslaved people on the property. Like Ewing, he came from a southern colony, Virginia. Ewing came from Maryland, where slavery was a critical part of the economy. Remember, the Walkers, the Scots, they're from Pennsylvania. They will never enslave anyone. Ewing, Neville, they will. That's the world they come from. And remember, in the beginning of our story, southwestern Pennsylvania was a part of Virginia for most of the Robinson Run time period. So John Neville, from his big Bower Hill estate in Scott Township, will begin collecting revenues. And he begins to organize the collection of revenues. But people immediately begin to turn on him. They begin to look at him suspiciously. They begin to make little scarecrows of him, effigies, we'll say, and light them on fire, and they cheer and they celebrate as he burns. This is very scary for Neville, but he knows these people, and that's really important. Everybody knows each other. So Neville's going to become the federal government's primary man on the ground here in the West, but he's very quickly going to turn into the man that's probably the face of the federal government in the West too. Men like the Walkers and Joseph Scott will not like him for obvious reasons. But men like James Ewing will side with him and be considered allies. This is a clipping from the Pittsburgh Gazette that John Neville puts in the newspaper to facilitate these embittered, almost rebellious now Western farmers to pay their taxes. He wants to make it easier. And it's a great document. The Pittsburgh Gazette, today the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, was the very first newspaper ever published west of the Appalachian Mountains. It's a historic newspaper, however you think about it today. But here's what the advertisement said. Essentially, he said, if you want to pay your tax, you can pay it based on county in a few different places. Of course, they didn't want to pay their tax. He says, in Bedford County, go to the home of Captain John Webster at Stony Creek. In Westmoreland County, the house of Philip Reagan in Greensburg, or near Greensburg. In Washington County, the house of John Lynn. This is in Cannonsburg. In Fayette County, the house of Benjamin Wells at Stewart's Crossing. This is Connellsville today. And in Allegheny County, he said, come to my house and pay it there. Now, John Neville had very practical reasons for putting this advertisement out there, and everybody in the West would have read this. That is to say, Western Pennsylvania and Western Virginia. But in turn, what he ultimately did, which of course he didn't mean to, was put a target on the backs of these tax collectors, because every single home you see here over the next 2 years will either be attacked or completely destroyed, burned to the ground. He was telling the rebels where to go if they want to attack the federal government. So there's a widening disconnect occurring here, a major problem, and little elements of life like this I think are really important for realizing that. By 1794, resistance has stiffened. The Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church has become home to what's called the Mingo Creek Association, or the Mingo Creek Associators. They are marching in armies, again, mostly their old Washington County militia units from the Revolution. And the federal government says enough is enough. And they begin to issue subpoenas for people who are delinquent on their taxes to appear in court. These subpoenas were about 60 in total, would be handed out personally by General John Neville as the Inspector of Revenue. And he'll be joined by a U.S. Marshal named David Lennox. Neville believed he should be the one handing out these subpoenas to his neighbors, because he believed they wouldn't attack him because they liked him and he knew them if he passed them out. He believed if a random Treasury agent began passing out these subpoenas to appear in court, he would have certainly have been attacked. So he and Marshal Lennox will begin in Pittsburgh in May of 1794 and begin working their way south toward Washington County, walking directly by Robinson Run, who knows, maybe even visiting it, passing out subpoenas saying, hey, you haven't paid, the time has come. You are now delinquent. This is a criminal activity. You must pay your tax. Marshal Lennox and John Neville will have a pretty uneventful time passing out these subpoenas for most of the day. What they don't realize is there's about 30 or 40 of their friends and neighbors, Western Pennsylvania farmers, angry Scots-Irishmen, steadily tracking behind them, following them, kind of spying on them. Where are these government agents going, and what exactly are they doing? Were the Walkers or the Scots involved in this action? We don't have direct evidence of it. But again, this was their neck of the woods. This was their neighborhood. So if Gabriel Walker and Isaac Walker and Joseph Scott were not actually in this group trailing the marshal and the general, they definitely had friends that were, and I'd be willing to bet family members, because they're all related for sure. When Marshal Lennox and General Neville get to what is today South Park, Pennsylvania, they're going to approach the homestead of a man named William Miller. Now, William Miller's homestead today exists within the bounds of South Park. It sits on the golf course. It's not there anymore, of course, but that's about where it was. And when they approached William Miller, there was sort of a scuffle, shouting, yelling. Somebody, and we think it was one of William Miller's farmhands, fired a musket into the air amidst the confusion. And we say these are the opening shots of the Whiskey Rebellion. When that shot was fired, those 30 or 40 frontiersmen that were tracking behind them rushed the general and rushed the marshal, and it was a big scrum. Nobody was hurt, but it was a very ugly scene. And they all knew each other. Super important. This is an intimate event. They knew everybody that was there, one another, and of course the general. Neville was able to calm things down. He told Marshal Lennox, you go back to downtown Pittsburgh. There's a fort there, Fort Fayette. It's a federal installation. And you go hide out there. Neville said, I'm going to go back to my estate in what is today Scott Township, Bower Hill, and I'm going to take shelter there. The image I have on the screen is one of the, if you live in the South Park area, southern Allegheny County, it's probably a place you know pretty well. This is what's called the Oliver Miller Homestead. This building was owned by William Miller's brother. It's not where the event happened. And believe it or not, it's not the actual building either. This is a building that was added onto and built onto the site over the last 200 years. But we use this spot as the primary point of interpretation for this moment, this sort of showdown at the William Miller homestead. And when you go in there, the people are awesome, amazing, wonderful people. There's a museum inside. There's Whiskey Rebellion documents. You can really get a real sense of 18th century life on the frontier there. And it's in the middle of a public park, so, find when it's open and go visit. But again, we don't have evidence that any of our Robinson Run people were here, but it's very hard for me to believe that they weren't attached to this in some way, shape, or form. It's sort of beyond my comprehension that they weren't there. So this is a critical moment, a critical point, and it's going to lead to really what is sort of one of the most important apexes of violence that's going to occur here in the year 1794. After the shots were fired at the William Miller homestead, General John Neville goes back to his mansion at Bower Hill. And he will hide out there. And inside the home were his wife and his daughter and one of her friends. And his daughter was, I think, 9 years old, something like that. And her friend was about the same age. This was not a military outpost in any way. It was a family home, a lavish family home, but a family home nevertheless. And while he's there, a group of rebels show up, and they are armed rebels, and they have the same muskets that they used in the American Revolution. And it's a very ugly, tense situation. And the reason the rebels are there is because they know that John Neville has a book in there, a ledger, that says who paid their taxes and who didn't. And in their minds, they hope to get a hold of that book and destroy it. And therefore, nobody knows who's on the right side of the law and who's not. Nobody knows who has squared up with the federal government and who hasn't. The reality is, they probably wouldn't have worked out that way. But they say, Neville, send out that book or else. They don't say what's going to happen. Neville, very scared, points a musket out the window and fires a shot. Now, these rebels are mostly hiding out in the trees and forests around Bower Hill. The bullet was kind of a random shot. It was about 75 to 100 yards away. And the person that the bullet hits on what we call the first day of the Battle of Bower Hill, that's ominous because you know there's going to be another, is a young boy, a teenager named Oliver Miller. Oliver Miller is hit by the bullet and killed. And as it turned out, by random chance, he was the nephew of William Miller, who fired at him the day earlier at what is today South Park. So for the rebels, it had to be intentional. There's no way this man didn't shoot this boy on purpose. From Neville's viewpoint, it was a random shot into the forest. But it could not have hit a worse target. Because young Oliver Miller will die. He'll become almost a martyr for the cause in the West. And this would have sent reverberations through all of western Pennsylvania. Not the least of which part being Robinson Run. For men like Isaac Walker and Gabriel Walker, they would have been incensed. They would have been angry, right? How could Neville do this, that scoundrel? For James Ewing, he would have seen this as another obstacle to peace, because that's really all he wanted. After the shots fired, the rebels will retreat to a place called Couch's Fort. For Allegheny County people, you'll know Fort Couch Road. Couch's Fort was a tiny frontier cabin, sort of a fortified house, near what is today South Hills Village Mall. Of course, the mall wasn't there at the time. But if you want to know where Couch's Fort was located, and we know this exactly, it's directly underneath what is today the McDonald's near South Hills Village Mall. So if you're at South Hills Village Mall, there's a McDonald's there. That's the exact location of Fort Couch. Into the 20th century, there'd be a tavern there eventually called the Frontier Inn, I think it was called. And I guess the back wall of it actually had original timbers from Couch's Fort. It's pretty neat. But they tore that down because, of course, we needed desperately another McDonald's. But if you want to find it, that's where it's going to be. When they're at Couch's Fort, they decide the next day they have to go back to Bower Hill with more men, almost twice as many, in fact. Not quite twice as many, but almost twice as many. Upwards of 600 to 700 men, we think. And they say we have to get that ledger book and put these people in their place. While they're there, they are joined by a local legend from Mingo Creek, a man named James McFarland. I always think of him like the Clint Eastwood of the story. Quiet man of great resolve, but a local hero of the revolution. And if he joined the movement, for most people, this is a guy that kind of kept to himself, that kind of stayed away from the community. If he came out of retirement and joined this movement, they must be on the right side of history. That's the idea. His endorsement was important. He wasn't a powerful political figure, but he was the quiet man that spoke softly and carried a big stick, a local hero of the revolution. So the next day, they're going to go back to Bower Hill, and they're going to try and accomplish what they couldn't on the first day. When they come back the next day, again, they come out in force, twice as many. John Neville is inside, petrified. He knew this was going to happen. He asked for soldiers in Pittsburgh to come out of Fort Fayette. Fort Fayette is roughly 9th Street downtown today by the Benham Center. And he said, can you occupy my home for this oncoming showdown? About 10 soldiers came out, led by a major named Abraham Kirkpatrick. When the rebels arrived, there was shouting, a very tense scene, almost like a movie. James McFarland, Clint Eastwood, that quiet man, this sort of reserved leader that's come off the bench to participate, walks into an open clearing with a white flag of truce. And he tells the men inside, because no one really wants a fight here, come outside, we're going to make terms, give us that ledger book, and we'll all go home. Well, as James McFarland, Clint Eastwood, right, comes out with his white flag of truce, one of the soldiers inside Bower Hill Mansion shoots at McFarland. Unthinkable under a flag of truce. And McFarland's hit in the leg, he's hit in the femoral artery, and he dies within minutes. It's an instant kill shot, effectively. And this, to the farmers, to the rebels, whatever you want to call them, seems like a bridge too far. This is the point where rationality and decency and proper gentlemanly behavior is out the window. They rush Bower Hill, and they burned the entire thing to the ground. John Neville's estate was big, over a dozen buildings. They torched them all here in July of 1794. And the burning of Bower Hill becomes a turning point in the movement, because this is when the Western Pennsylvanians, including the Walkers and the Scots, again, we don't have evidence they were at Bower Hill, but they certainly knew of this or heard about it immediately. Bower Hill is about 3 miles from Robinson Run. Again, John Neville's property borders James Ewing's property. They were certainly involved in this or the aftermath. It's beyond comprehension. They couldn't be. After this occurs, the entire nature of the rebellion changes. Now, what I want to do with you is go to the site of Bower Hill, see what's there today, walk you through the battle. It's a long episode, folks, but we're all here, and get our hands really dirty on this one and take a look at it. So hang tight. We'll be there in a second.
Here we are on the former site of General John Neville's grand plantation estate, Bower Hill. This is a busy street. This is Kane Boulevard behind me. And very few people who drive by ever really take notice of the blue Pennsylvania and Historical Commission marker that sits here. And very few people in this area realize we are actually standing on a battlefield, and one of the most important battlefields, not only in Western Pennsylvania and in Pittsburgh, but in American history. So a little bit of information about this site. This is the home of General John Neville, and he had a wonderful grand estate here he called Bower Hill. Now, John Neville, as I mentioned, was a Revolutionary War hero. He was a personal ally of George Washington. He was, like Washington, also a Virginian. And John Neville established what I would describe as a Virginia-style plantation here in what is at the time Allegheny County, before that Washington County. He had crops growing here. He had enslaved people here. Because again, remember, Western Pennsylvania was Virginia for most of its early history in the 18th century. John Neville had a target on his back in a very real sense as the Inspector of Revenue for the 4th District here in and around Western Pennsylvania. And on July 16th, after the events that we previously discussed at what is today South Park at the home of William Miller, angry Revolutionary War veterans who feel like their rights are being violated, who feel like their government's treating them unfairly, are going to target this grand mansion estate that sits on top of this hill. Now, there's not much to see here today other than the PHMC marker. Of course, there's a hospital beside me and a church on the other side. But luckily for us, we do have a remaining portion of the Bower Hill estate intact. And it's called the Woodville Plantation. And it's a wonderful museum with amazing people. Some of my best friends work and volunteer there and manage that site. Great people. And you can visit it. But if we take a look at the Woodville Plantation House, just for some examples, this is the home of John Neville's son, Presley Neville. It more or less looked like the Bower Hill mansion that would have sat here, with the exception that the Bower Hill mansion that sat here had one additional story built onto it, so it was taller. But this is going to be the location, and it was a grand location for John Neville. It sits way up on a hill. We're in Scott Township. The Chartiers Creek runs just behind me. And he had a commanding view, as I'll show you, for miles around. He owned thousands of acres. And he was, amongst the wealthiest men, not just in Pittsburgh, but all of the West. And this was a grand statement, the plantation house that he had here. The Washington Pike, which ran just behind me, the primary roadway between Pittsburgh and Washington, made this a central location. We have really great accounts of what Bower Hill as a plantation estate looked like. But what brings us here is July 16th, 1794. Because on July 16th, 1794, we're going to see right around 500 rebels, maybe a little less, show up here armed and angry about the deteriorating situation in the West. And they will declare that This property, John Neville's home, needs to be surrendered, and any tax documentation that they may have needs to be handed over. This will result in gunfire from inside the mansion house, fired by John Neville himself. Now, Neville's just inside with his wife and family. It's a very tense and scary situation, but it happened right here. And in that gunfire, a teenage boy named Oliver Miller will be shot and killed. And this is kind of a moment, and really realistically, it was kind of a random shot. But this is a moment that really sees the Whiskey Rebellion, if you would, kind of coalesce into the point of no return. Because on July 16th, after the death of that teenage boy, those rebels will leave here. They'll rally at a place called Couch's Fort, which is not there anymore. But if you want to know a good indicator for it, a good marker for it, it sits right where the McDonald's sits, near South Hills Village Mall. So South Hills Village Mall is not far away. And if you see the golden arches of that McDonald's, you found Couch's Fort. They come back the next day with almost double the men, July 17th, 1794. And now there's federal troops waiting inside the mansion. And they engage in a firefight once again, and it's a big one. And Bower Hill will be completely destroyed. That plantation home is completely burned to the ground, and it's never been back. And that's the reason there's no part of it left today. But this is kind of the moment for us. The Whiskey Rebellion falls into the hands of the extreme elements, the partisans of the group. Moderate people, reasonable people have largely left by this point. The destruction of Bower Hill, the most fabulous plantation in the West, probably to that point anywhere, is a real difficult moment in American history, and it's what brings us here today. Now, what can we say about our Robinson Run crew? Were they here? It's very hard to say. And it's hard to say because we don't have great records of who was at this site. The Scots-Irish were not generally overly fond of writing histories down. They are an oral people. They share oral traditions. So here's what I can tell you. Robinson Run, as the crow flies, is directly behind me, about 2 miles away. If you were to go to James Ewing's fort, which, you know, for our purposes is sort of the tail end of Noblestown Road where it meets Interstate 79, that's about 2 miles over my head. Right there. Right about there. So it is completely within reason that guys like Isaac Walker and Gabriel Walker and Joseph Scott were here at the burning of Bower Hill. It's a seminal moment in the history of the frontier. We just don't have any record of them being here. So I'm going to say maybe. And I'm going to talk about this event because it's so important. And again, we don't know if they're here or not, but I think it's so close to their orbit, I can say for certainty, even if they weren't here, they knew people here. So here at the Battle of Bower Hill, you can see the PHMC marker here over my shoulder. For the western frontier, the world changes. And this is a critical step in the history of the Whiskey Rebellion. So we'll jump back into the office. We'll catch us up. Hang tight.
So we saw kind of the high water mark, if you would, or maybe not. Maybe there's still one to come of the Whiskey Rebellion to this point. And we saw that it all happened within about 3 miles of the region we've been studying this whole time. Robinson Run. What the problem the Whiskey Rebels run into, and they gather at Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church to kind of work this out, is that when Bower Hill is burned, all of the legitimate leadership of the movement has abandoned them. You know, William Finley was a congressman. He was there in 1791 to draft those resolves. But when Bower Hill's burned, he's out. Albert Gallatin is now a U.S. Senator. He's out. These are men that base their lives in public life, and they can't be associated with this. You know, the extremists seem to have taken over the whole event and the whole movement. So they say, you guys have gone too far. You're on your own. We are leaving this. So the Whiskey Rebels begin to look for a new leader, and the man that they find is an attorney from Washington County named David Bradford. David Bradford is not a traditional frontiersman. He's from Maryland. He wears fancy clothes. He is obsessed with the affairs of Europe. He loves the French Revolution. He's erudite. He's the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General of all of Washington County. And he's a very big supporter of the Whiskey Rebels. But he knows enough as an attorney not to be involved in their affairs because it's totally illegal. This is treasonous. It's sedition. So David Bradford does not participate. But after Bower Hill, he gets a knock on his door. And you can see that mansion and that door today in downtown Washington. I'll put a picture up. It's called the David Bradford House. It's still there. It's a mansion by any measure. And the Whiskey Rebels will tell him, we need a leader and we need you, Bradford, to come down to Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church and lead our movement. And Bradford is hesitant to do it. But somewhere along the line, it doesn't seem to take long, a switch flips. Bradford leans into this action. He shows up in a military uniform. He rides around Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church on horseback. He calls himself the Robespierre of the West. And Robespierre is the man, if you're not familiar, from the French Revolution, who's chopping everybody's head off. Thousands of heads roll from the guillotine. That's Robespierre. Bradford calls himself the Robespierre of the West. And he says, if we're going to do a rebellion, we're going to do it my way. We're not a protest movement anymore. We're no longer dissatisfied with the federal government. Bradford says, our new goal is secession, separation. He says we're going to secede in full rebellion from the United States of America. He sends representatives down the Ohio River to New Orleans to meet with the Spanish. He asks if Western Pennsylvania, Southwestern Pennsylvania, can join them rather than the Americans. It's a very dangerous time. And Bradford's next move, which is the biggest of all, is to have a massive rally at a place called Braddock's Field in 1794, August of 1794, to potentially march on Pittsburgh. Now, why Braddock's Field? Well, Braddock's Field is like an unofficial kind of public park for Pittsburgh at this time. It's hallowed ground. It was the site of the Battle of the Monongahela, Braddock's defeat, right near Kennywood, Braddock, Pennsylvania, in 1755. There are still human remains, skeletons, and bones on the battlefield. It's a sacred space. And Bradford says we should rally our forces there from not just Washington County, but Allegheny County, Bedford, Westmoreland, even some of the Western Virginia counties, Fayette County, and we should march on Pittsburgh. His goals are a little bit mixed. At the least, Bradford wants to capture the federal fort, Fort Fayette, in the city. He wants to take those weapons out of there and arm his men with them. But maybe they'll ransom the city. Or maybe they'll even burn and destroy it. Who knows? But that's going to be the plan. And that's going to be what we see in August of 1794. Bradford will say that there's 7,000 men at Braddock's Field. That would probably be impossible. There's only 20,000 people in Washington County total. So that means 1 out of 3 people were there. I don't buy it. Others say like 1,500 men were there probably. But they will meet on Braddock's Field in August of 1794, and they will march on Pittsburgh. Fortunately for Pittsburgh, the city is saved. As they march, they have a flag. It has 6 stripes, 1 for each county involved in this movement. They're saying it's a separatist flag. They burn buildings and structures as they march into the city. The city is largely saved, believe it or not by the soldiers in Pittsburgh, but by the women of Pittsburgh. Because remember, they all know each other. The women meet the rebels on the field. They bring them plates of bacon and cheese and kegs of beer and whiskey, and they get them full to the belly, right, and maybe a little bit drunk, and they actually convince them to go back home. And that's what saves the city of Pittsburgh. But that's also what's going to be the last straw for President Washington, because he has been keeping his eye on this movement for 4 years now, and the fact that the most important city of the whole frontier, Pittsburgh, has been attacked, or maybe almost attacked, is a line he won't cross. He believes now is the time for military action. So we're going to jump to Braddock's Field right now. Hang on. It's a long episode, but it's a good one. It's worth it. And we're going to see what the rebels do at Braddock's Field. and we're going to set the stage for our very next episode of Robinson Run. Hang tight, we'll be there in a second.
All right, everybody, I am here on the site of the Braddock's Battlefield History Center in Braddock, Pennsylvania. This is a very historic site, and that has a lot to do with the reason that we're here today. In 1755, Major General Edward Braddock's army on its march to Fort Duquesne was annihilated here by 300 French troupes de la marine and about 700 native warriors from the Great Lakes. But that is not the reason we're here today. Because we are here today because on August 1st, 1794, David Bradford, the demagogic new leader of this, what we'll call Whiskey Rebellion, asked all the people with seditious inclinations around Allegheny County, Westmoreland County, Washington County, to come here to this site. And their plan was to meet, rally, and discuss their next plan of action. Now, a couple things that are going to happen at this site. Number one, most importantly for us, Isaac Walker, for sure. Joseph Scott, for sure. And potentially Gabriel Walker were at this site. Now, if you can imagine this site on a hot August day in 1794, Bradford would say there were 7,000 people here preparing to, as it were, march on the city of Pittsburgh. We think that number is a little high. I put it more around 1,500 to 2,000, but still a substantial amount of people. And many consider this to be the high watermark of the Whiskey Rebellion here in the West. When they were on this site, the Whiskey Rebels elected to actually not just resist the federal government, but to secede from the Union. They actually made a flag with a stripe for every county that participated in it. David Bradford, fiery, passionate, kind of treated this as a point of no return. As it would turn out, he would become the superstar of this event. He sort of patrolled around on a white horse. People toasted him, people from all over Western Pennsylvania. But he actually got cold feet before this started, and he tried to cancel it. And once that ball's rolling, it doesn't really stop. But this is a really amazing place. You know, in the city of Pittsburgh in the 1790s, Braddock's Battlefield was kind of an unofficial first public park in a way. The battle that raged here 40 years earlier was intense and fiery and chaotic. By 1794, here comes a train, look at that. By 1794, there were still bones on the battlefield. And people had sort of chosen to preserve this space as a place to meet publicly. So for David Bradford and the Whiskey Rebels to select Braddock's Battlefield as the site of this march on Pittsburgh was a very, very telling thing. Now, again, Isaac Walker is here. Joseph Scott is here. Our Robinson Run community members are here. And this is what is going to really stick with them in the future as sort of cementing them as full-scale participants in the Whiskey Rebellion. Gabriel Walker may have been here. We're not certain of that. It's likely, but we don't have smoking gun evidence of that. But it's from this site on August 1st, 1794 that the Whiskey Rebels would begin to march into Pittsburgh, led by David Bradford. And they had a few different goals. One was they wanted to raid the federal fort inside the city. And by doing that, take gunpowder and stores and supplies. That was something that they were very interested in. But other parts of it could have been more terrible, more frightening, potentially even destroying the city of Pittsburgh itself. They never got that far. They did burn barns and outbuildings. As they marched into the city, it was the women of Pittsburgh that actually managed to turn them away with barrels of beer and plates of cheese and bacon. Again, these people all knew each other. But this was the moment, really, that President Washington back in Philadelphia, with this mob marching on Pittsburgh, which was effectively the capital of the American West, trying to destroy it. This is what's going to lead him to say we need to send in troops to the West and suppress this rebellion. So for our purposes on this show, yes, the Braddock's Field meeting where we are right now, August 1st, 1794, was a major event. But it's also the event where we see really truly with a paper trail. Men like Isaac Walker and Joseph Scott fully committing to the seditious cause.